Welcome to Book Talk. It can be a majestic sight, that glittering chamber full of gilt and heraldry, the hundreds of peers in their scarlet ermine-trimmed robes. But what does the House of Lords actually do? The answer to that question used to be that it does nothing in particular and does it very well. But my guest today, the constitutional scholar Meg Russell, takes a different view. Her new book, The Contemporary House of Lords, describes an increasingly powerful and assertive House of Parliament. And Meg, once upon a time, the Lords almost looked obsolete, something that was ripe for abolition. But not, you're saying, anymore.
Well, it is a more powerful player in the parliamentary process than it used to be as a result of the reform in 1999, which removed most hereditary peers. It's been a gradual process. The reform in 1958 to introduce life peers is the one which most people believe saved the House of Lords from absolute oblivion. Revived it to some extent, but the 1999 reform, which is my starting point for the book, was equally important.
So most of the hereditary aristocracy went at that point, and the House of Lords therefore became a bit more credible because it wasn't people who were there because, you know, a distant ancestor had been one of Charles II's mistresses or something like that. Yeah,
well, the 99 reform was important for a couple of reasons. It removed the most indefensible element of the chamber, which was the great majority of people who had inherited their seats. And coincidentally, one of the reasons that Labour had wanted the reform was that a lot of those people were Conservatives. By removing them, the chamber also became much more party politically balanced. Ironically, it became more in line with the way that people vote in general elections than the House of Commons. Those two things gave the chamber, therefore, both the ability to defeat governments, ask governments to think again more, because the government didn't have a majority, and even a Conservative government wouldn't have a majority there these days. And it also gave it greater confidence to press government for policy change.
So you have, as it were, a hung council where opinion can swing. And why is that important in terms of what the Lords actually does? Because most people don't know what the Lords actually does. Does it just debate laws in the same way as the Commons? Does it do something slightly different?
Broadly, it does the same things as the House of Commons, or most of the same things as the House of Commons. So it considers legislation and it holds government to account through things like committees and question time on the floor. But all of those things it does in a slightly different way to the Commons. It's a bit procedurally different, but also, more importantly, it's culturally very different. It's well known for having a range of expert members. It clearly has this no-party majority situation now. It's a very different chamber for government to have to face than is the House of Commons. Because of the lack of majority, defeats in the House of Lords are very common. And the Labour government suffered over 450 defeats between 1999 and 2010. And the coalition continues to be defeated there. Defeats in the House of Commons are big news. Defeats in the House of Lords happen all the time.
Almost on a weekly basis. I mean, the coalition's had, I don't know, it must be into the hundreds now of defeats since it took office in 2010. But those defeats tend to be on really quite detailed points of legislation a lot of the time, don't they? What happens is that the House of Lords scrutinises laws much more closely, and so you might get a defeat on the need for a different review procedure for something, or a clause goes into look again at some issue in 2 years' time, or something like that.
Yeah, well, one of the other cultural differences between the Lords and the Commons is that it's really the Commons as the elected chamber that decides the kind of big political picture, and the Lords does tend to focus on the detail, and sometimes it focuses on matters which receive relatively less attention in the Commons. There's a particular interest in there partly because of the number of lawyers in constitutional propriety, for example, whereas MPs are much more responsive to their constituents, concerned about health and welfare, those kinds of things. But some of the defeats have been on very big things. We saw some big policy reversals under Tony Blair on things like trial by jury as a result of defeats in the Lords. And one of the things which I emphasise in the book, which I think relatively few people outside Parliament, was the central role that the Liberal Democrats gained in British politics years before the coalition began, because they were the swing voters in the House of Lords. They were the ones who really decided under Labour whether the government won or lost a vote. So they were becoming powerful players and working alongside the Conservatives in the Lords to defeat Labour for years before they entered government.
But even now, in the coalition, with the Liberal Democrats in harness with the Conservatives, the government continues to lose votes in the House of Lords on a fairly regular basis. So what else is happening?
Well, that's right. There were some people who were a bit worried that with the Liberal Democrats going into government, they'd been so important as a sort of linchpin vote in the Lords under Labour that the Lords would be stifled, would be powerless in the face of the coalition. But actually what's happened is that the large group of independent crossbenchers in the Lords, who are a fascinating group, who are very little known outside Parliament, they effectively stepped into the breach and they have become the arbiters now. So we've got this large group of independent, non-partisan people in the Lords effectively deciding the outcome of virtually every vote. They've become much more active since the 2010 election, and yet they're virtually unknown in the country.
And actually the number of government defeats almost understates the influence the Lords has, because ministers will often feel that they have to kind of preemptively make concessions to stave off the possibility of losing a vote.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There are two good reasons, two obvious reasons why ministers will want to listen to the House of Lords. One is because it contains quite a lot of well-respected experts, and sometimes ministers might be genuinely convinced that somebody has a good point that they hadn't understood, or they might believe that an expert opposing them on something is going to cause them some embarrassment, so they rethink. But of course the other reason why they listen is because of the numbers, because they know that when it comes down to it they can be defeated, and therefore they tend to negotiate, and an awful lot of time goes on in Whitehall to second guessing what the Lords will say. And one of the crucial things which distinguishes the culture of the Lords from the Commons is there is constant discussion amongst people from different parties in there in a way that would be quite alien in the Commons. So the government is continually talking to non-government people, not only its own backbenchers, but people on the other side and crossbenchers, about what they are prepared to accept in legislation. And people from the non-government bits of the House, the opposition parties and the crossbenchers and government backbenchers, are also continually talking to each other.
So you can get these sort of ad hoc little alliances, a couple of Liberal Democrats here, a couple of dissident Conservatives there, a lot of crossbenchers, and maybe Labour as the sort of keystone of any Lord's defeat for the government.
There's a far more cross-party culture in there, but in a funny way it's very subtle, but there's also a less partisan culture in some respects because of the presence of the crossbenchers who sort of tone the debate down. It never gets too partisan because the crossbenchers hold the balance and they will be alienated by party political point scoring. So it's a sort of calmer form of debate, and it's less party political in some ways, but in other ways it's intensely political.
I was going to ask you about that, because there is a suggestion that the House of Lords is actually getting the kind of the virus of Commons-style party politics in there. You'll hear a lot of government backbench peers complaining that Labour's imported in a lot of sort of heavy metal old Commons MPs who are now making the place a lot more like the Commons. Derisive sniff. And at that point they think that it's all becoming a bit too bare knuckle, and the atmosphere that made the Lords distinctive that you've just been describing is beginning to evaporate a bit.
Well, there's all kinds of subtle change going on, but I think some of that is just your classic kind of parliamentary decline, wasn't it better in the old days stuff. There's a chapter in the book on the history of the House of Lords where I show pretty conclusively that actually the number of former MPs in the House of Lords was higher in previous centuries and higher at the beginning of the 20th century than it is now. So there's a bit of golden ageism going on there, although at the same time it is true that there are more people coming in and acting more like full-time politicians because the numbers are very tight now, and therefore attendance levels amongst peers have gone up. It's become a much more full-time House than it was a few years ago.
But there's still plenty of peers who don't turn up at all, aren't there? I mean, there's one of the constant complaints is that the formal membership of the House of Lords is somewhere north of, 800 peers
More
now.
than 800 now, yeah.
And yet, even so, quite a lot of people, even though the place seems to be crammed to the gunwales, quite a lot of people are hardly turning up at all. And there's even talk of a retirement mechanism to allow them to go away altogether.
The number of non-attenders is now relatively low, actually, and of course you can account for it in part because of some of them being very elderly. I mean, that you get in there as a result of a life peerage, and a life peerage is kind of a life sentence in some senses. You can't end your life peerage.
Damnation without relief.
You can sort of unofficially withdraw from the chamber, taking what's called leave of absence, but there's no way out apart from death, and that is one of the minor reforms that people talk about introducing. But the active membership of the House is bigger now than it has ever been.
Now, the House of Lords is supposed to be a revising chamber. It's supposed to be able, in extreme cases, to make the government think again about something. But the House of Commons is always supposed to be able, in the end, to get its way by using this mechanism called the Parliament Act, where the Commons basically passes the same bill twice in successive years, and then it goes into law and leapfrogs over the Lords if they object to it. Now, that is hardly ever used in the end. You often get this kind of legislative high noon, where at the end of a parliamentary session, bills are bouncing back and forth between the two houses, trying to avoid that with some sort of compromise. But why is that so seldom used? Is it simply that it's just too time-consuming and too much of a blunt instrument?
Well, you say that the House of Lords will bow to the elected chamber in the end, but normally that happens through negotiation, not through pushing it to the ultimate conflict via the Parliament Act. One of the interesting things that I show in the book is that in all of these defeats, the over 450 defeats under Blair and Brown and the considerable number under the coalition, one of the most significant aspects in the government deciding whether or not to accept a defeat is whether there's dissent on its own benches. So in a way what the Lords does is it kicks things back to the Commons and says to MPs, are you sure? And if MPs aren't sure, if there's any dissent on the government benches, any discomfort, it's then that the government is likely to back down. So it's more of a process of negotiation, which is normally resolved through MPs either saying, yes, we are sure, thank you very much, please go away, or saying, actually, no, we're not, then maybe we should negotiate and let's come to a compromise here.
Yeah. One of the most interesting case studies recently has been the bill to allow gay marriage to take place, and MPs agonised quite a lot about that. There were a lot of dissidents on the Conservative benches, quite a few in some of the other parties as well in the Commons, but it seemed there's almost a stronger majority for gay marriage in the Lords than there had been in the Commons, which suggests that the House of Lords is a lot more liberal than it used to be, because once upon a time things like changing the age of consent was something that was resisted much more strongly in the Lords than by MPs.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Parliament Act, and I was going to say in response to that some of the few examples on which the Parliament Act has had to be used are those sort of classic conscience issues, and one was this one on the age of gay versus straight consent back in the 1990s, just immediately prior to reform. Those were really arguments between the Commons and the Lords rather than between government and Parliament, because there'd been free votes in both houses. And in free votes, MPs were in favour of a more progressive position and Lords were traditionally conservative. But it's turned on its head now with the gay marriage vote, where it overwhelmingly went through the Lords. Many people had been frightened that this conservative institution was going to get in the way of this change. I wasn't that concerned, because I thought the Lords has changed, and sure enough, the vote demonstrated the extent to which the Lords has changed. I think those out there who think it's still a conservative institution were quite surprised.
Let's talk a little bit about the future here. I mean, one of the interesting issues about the House of Lords is that you've got a coalition government at the moment, two parties forming a majority in the Commons, if not actually forming a majority in the Lords. What happens if we get a single-party government again? Would it be easy for, say, an incoming Labour government to get its legislation through? Now the House of Lords has had this sort of taste of power that it's been getting.
Well, there's a curious paradox in that I would say that if David Cameron had won an overall majority in the House of Commons in 2010, he would have been a weaker Prime Minister, because in the House of Lords, the Lib Dems would not have been voting with him. They would have been voting an awful lot of the time with Labour on things like benefit cuts and healthcare reform, and he would have had a great deal of difficulty for the first time really as a Conservative Prime Minister faced with a centre-left aligned House of Lords, and that would have been really interesting, and people would have sat up and taken notice. In opposition in the Lords, under Labour, the Lib Dems rather sort of pushed the boundaries of convention. I mean, the Lords demonstrates a great deal of constraint. It doesn't push too hard at the elected chamber, but the boundaries have been being stretched. First, it was the Lib Dems under Labour. Now, Labour under the coalition is pushing the boundaries further. So I think under the next government, if it's a single-party government, a Labour government may find it slightly more difficult than before. A Conservative government will find it more difficult than they have ever known it to get their business through the House of Lords. And one, I suppose, other looking ahead point is that this Parliament has rejected the idea now of having an elected House of Lords. They rejected it for procedural reasons rather than actually the principle, but the whole idea of electing peers has gone out the window now. Are we ever going to see anything like that come back, or is the House of Lords pretty much as it is now going to be with us for the foreseeable future? Well, on reform, that's another area full of paradoxes. I mean, the main arguments in favour of big reform used to be that the House was illegitimate and that it was weak and not very effective. But the last 14 years or so have seen it become more legitimate, or at least believe itself to be more legitimate and therefore become more confident. And it's actually fairly popular amongst the public. They quite like the fact that it gives the government a bloody nose now and again, and that it's got these independent members and experts. So it's considered more legitimate. It's less weak than it used to be, which means that the argument for wholesale reform is less attractive, and it's particularly less attractive to government, who think, goodness, if this lot are giving us a difficult time, then just think if it was elected how powerful they would be and how difficult it would become. So small-scale reform is possible. In the past, it's only ever been small-scale reform which has made it through. So things like trimming the Prime Minister's powers of patronage, stopping the size of the chamber, just getting bigger and bigger as it has been doing. David Cameron's put around 150 people in there in the last 3 years, and the size is going up and up. But actually, the main opponents of small-scale reform, of sort of cleaning up the system as it is, if you like, are those who want large-scale reform, because they realise that the more acceptable the place becomes, the less controversial it becomes, the less likely they are to get their ultimate goal of an elected House.
Plenty of material there for a whole new sequel. Meg Russell, thanks very much for joining us. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.